Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming today. Not all of you, I don't think, are aware, but this Knowledge Connections is co-hosted by the BRI trainee executive. So the research trainees have come together to form a group, and we've been hosting our own rounds monthly, but we joined with BRI this month to host our two speakers today. So our first speaker today will be Samantha Stevens. I was a research fellow at Sickkids in neurology and pediatric demyelinating disorders. She's interested in measurement and health outcomes related to physical activity for children with chronic diseases. Then Dr. Catherine Sabiston will present. She's an associate professor of exercise and health psychology at the University of Toronto and holds a Canadian research chair in physical activity and mental health. Dr. Sabiston's research primarily focuses on psychosocial strategies to improve physical activity among individuals across the lifespan and how physical activity relates to mental health. Catherine has 140 peer-reviewed articles, as well as numerous book chapters, and has been involved in over 300 conference presentations and community public health talks. She has received numerous career awards and has held nearly $17 million in funding to conduct her research. She's also the director of the newly developed Mental Health and Physical Activity Research Center at the University of Toronto and leads the Health, Behavior, and Emotion Laboratory. So I will let Sam come up to begin.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you for inviting me here today to speak about moving for brain health and evidence-based physical activity for youth with chronic diseases. And so today what I would like to speak to you about is the importance of physical activity in children and how it's important for their optimal health and growth and development. And to then discuss some of the reasons why we think children with chronic diseases become inactive or are inactive due to their illnesses. And I'll briefly describe an intervention that we conducted in kids with juvenile arthritis and describe to you some of the findings from that study and how this has really led to a lot of the work that I was involved with while conducting my PhD in building tools and evaluating techniques that could be used to deliver a behavioral intervention as well as outcome measures to assess physical activity interventions in the future. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, the Canadian health guidelines suggest that children should participate in 60 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous physical activity in order to maintain optimal health and growth and development. Children, the most recent Canadian Health Measures Survey let us know that was actually just, the report card was just released last week, says that children who are between the ages of 5 and 17 are extremely inactive, with only 9% of the healthy population meeting the current recommendations of 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. And this is problematic because we know that, as I've been saying before, that participating in physical activity helps optimize growth and development in children. And we know that in the absence of physical activity, in terms of brain function, we know that there's less neurogenesis. There's a loss of executive control. And there's actually just recently published in Medicine and Sport and Sciences a systematic review by Donnelly where they looked at the effects of physical fitness and physical activity on executive function, memory, and just overall brain function in children ages 5 to 13 years, and found that, in fact, there is strong moderate level of evidence to suggest that physical activity is very important to brain function in developing children, in terms of memory, in terms of learning, in terms of perception. So it's important that these kids are active. And to bring it back to kids with chronic diseases, I'm currently involved in working with kids with multiple sclerosis. And we know that their trajectory over time, they're diagnosed at a young age, around 10, and their trajectory over time is a loss of cognition, a loss of memory, a lot of brain deficits over time. So this might be one way that we can affect their long-term outcome in terms of their brain function. We also know that physical activity participation is associated with depression. And again, using the MS sample, we did a cross-sectional study where we looked at physical activity levels and measured depression and fatigue in these children, and found that kids with low levels of physical activity participation had higher levels of depression and fatigue. So again, this is an area that we can intervene and hopefully improve their health outcome in terms of brain function and quality of life. And finally, I think most importantly, physical activity is related to quality of life. We've shown over and over again, you can look at health-related quality of life, you can look at overall quality of life, and we know that people who participate in more physical activity report that they have a better overall quality of life, or health-related quality of life for that matter. We also know that children with chronic diseases are very deconditioned. So when we look at cardiorespiratory fitness, or musculoskeletal fitness for that matter, we know that children with a variety of different chronic conditions are less fit than their otherwise healthy peers. And in the slide that I'm showing here is from some colleagues in the Utrecht who have studied a variety of different children with from spina bifida to cerebral palsy. And what they did is they compared their cardiorespiratory fitness measured on a cycle ergometer with a peak oxygen consumption measured, which is an indice of fitness. And they compared that to age and sex matched controls. And what they found is that on average, children with chronic diseases across a spectrum are their fitness levels are about 2 standard deviations below that of healthy children, which suggests that, again, that these kids are very unfit. Why is it important that children maintain a high level of musculoskeletal or cardiorespiratory fitness? Well, as I'm sure many of you may have learned in some of your exercise physiology or kinesiology classes, that as you age, as you grow, you make gains in your musculoskeletal fitness and cardiorespiratory fitness over time until you reach middle age around 30 or 40, at which time that trajectory starts to decrease slowly by about, 5 or 10% per year over time. And the important thing to note with this trajectory that I've have on the slide here is that there's a line that represents a threshold for dependence or independent living outside of disability. And we know that children with chronic conditions who are unfit, their trajectory may be steeper towards disability. So later in life or earlier in life than your typically developing person, they may experience disability, which has a whole host of problems, introduces a whole host of problems in terms of their ability to work, their ability to care for themselves, and costs in terms of health care. So we know, for instance, again, using the pediatric MS kids, there was a retrospective study where they compared children with pediatric onset multiple sclerosis to adults who had a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, and looked at the age of onset of disability. And that was coined in terms of their ability to walk 500 meters, 100 meters, or 10 meters without assistance. And what they found is that children who had been diagnosed with MS experienced disability, the onset of disability, about 10 years before adults experienced it, which means that children with MS experience disability in their mid-30s to early 50s. And we think this is a problem. This is an area that we could intervene and hopefully delay that onset of disability. But why are children with chronic diseases inactive? Oded Bar-Or, who was a pediatric exercise physiologist, proposed this model, and Thomas Rowland as well, of a cycle of deconditioning. And what they proposed is that children have an illness. So I'll use juvenile arthritis as an example, where they have severe joint pain often, and sometimes movement can cause more pain for them. So in terms of their illness causes them to have fear of perhaps exasperating their disease, and so they become less active. This has a detraining effect. The less active you are, you lose some functional ability. And we think that this is a continual process. And so we hypothesize that physical activity and exercise training can disrupt this process and limit the functional deterioration that children with chronic conditions often experience. So I'd like to just take a brief moment and describe to you the PEAK study, which was a randomized controlled trial that we conducted in 80 children with juvenile arthritis. And the purpose of this trial was to see if an exercise intervention could improve their walking economy or their functional abilities. We also included a number of secondary outcomes. So we also saw if we could improve their physical fitness, their quality of life, fatigue as well. So the children were randomized into either a treatment program, which consisted of cardio karate, or this was done in the early 2000s, so this was at the time when Taebo was really popular. Most people probably don't even know about Taebo now, but and then they were randomized to an attention placebo program, so they received the same amount of attention from an instructor, but they were participating in Qigong, which is very similar in movement to Tai Chi. So they went through 18 different postures in their program, but it was of a very light intensity, so it would not raise their heart rate, and we wouldn't expect them to derive a training effect from this. The children in both programs met over 12 weeks, 3 times a week, once weekly in a group session, which was led by a trained instructor, and twice weekly with a progressive video program. Progressive in the terms of intensity. We asked them to keep improving their intensity over time. And what we found from this study was that the children, despite all of our best efforts, the instructors called them, we gave them gifts, we gave them cool swag, hats, water bottles, t-shirts, we were reminding them to be active, and despite all of this, we found that the children in the experimental program did not derive a training effect in terms of their cardiorespiratory fitness and in our main outcome, which was functional fitness measured by their walking economy. However, I want to note that both programs reported that their overall quality of life was better following either program. And so we were curious as to why we didn't derive a training effect. Again, as I said, we thought we had put forth every possible mechanism to make this a successful study. And despite this, we found that only 56% of the children in the experimental program only participated in about half of the sessions that they were asked to participate in. So that's one problem. And so we also conducted qualitative interviews with these children and their families and the instructors. And from that, we got a sense that there was maybe a mismatch between the program that we had prescribed to these children, that maybe children weren't really interested in doing video programs at home on their own, as well as we found that some of the children, some of the themes from the qualitative analysis suggested that some children were ready to take part in physical activity of this nature, and some children were maybe not ready to take part. And so this got us really starting to think differently about how we would next intervene with these children to get them to be more active. And we started thinking about maybe we should propose a behavioral intervention to change their behaviors around physical activity, as well as maybe it would be better to propose that children take part in activity that they want to take part in, like in a lifestyle intervention. So with this in mind, moving towards implementing a behavioral intervention, there were a number of tools that we needed to put together. So we needed an outcome measurement tool to determine how much physical activity these kids were doing in their daily lives outside of a lab. So we looked, and we also wanted a tool, could we improve adherence in children with chronic diseases to physical activity? So we started thinking about different behavioral models that we knew about. So we thought about the trans-theoretical model of change, which suggests that you go through a series of steps in adopting a new behavior. So we wanted to look and see if there was a scale that we could use in order to identify where a child was at, and hopefully tailor an intervention so that the children, so that we could improve adherence as well. And then finally, we wanted to identify what behavioral strategies or theories would be most effective at getting children with chronic conditions to move more. So we conducted a trial, or a validity study looking at accelerometers. How many people are familiar with accelerometry? So a few. Oh, a lot. Okay, great. So for those of you who are not familiar, how many of you have an iPhone? And how many people do some sort of fitness tracker or something like that, like step counter? Okay. So basically, an accelerometer measures movement patterns, and those movement counts are then transformed oftentimes by using a proprietary equation into energy expenditures or calories expended. So we wanted to know how accurate is an accelerometer in measuring energy expenditure in children with chronic diseases, because we knew that these equations that transformed the counts into energy expenditure units had only been calibrated in kids otherwise healthy children. So they may not be accurate in children. So we looked at a sample of 180 children with different chronic conditions, and we took the most popular equations that were used to transform these counts from accelerometers into energy expenditures, and we looked to see how accurate they were in our sample. And we found actually that they were highly inaccurate. And this is probably due to difference in movement patterns, differences in resting energy expenditures in children with chronic diseases that just weren't accounted for in the calibrations studies that were conducted in otherwise healthy children. So we have now provided some initial equations that are more accurate for kids with chronic conditions. And as well, we've developed cut points so that we can take the counts and define threshold levels for if they're being sedentary in their activity, if they're doing light activity, moderate or vigorous activity as well. And we also looked at the stages of exercise scale as a scale that we could use to hopefully improve adherence. And we conducted a validity study of this in kids with juvenile arthritis, juvenile dermatomyositis, and cystic fibrosis. And we also found with this scale that it was valid in our population. So we're able to use this tool as well. And finally, we wanted to know, are there important behavioral theories or techniques that we could use in a future trial to promote physical activity in these children? So we conducted a systematic review where we looked at all the literature for interventions that have been conducted in children with a chronic condition across basically any chronic condition. To see if the exercise intervention had a primary or secondary outcome to increase physical activity. And we found 35 trials that looked at this, where physical activity was a primary or secondary outcome. And we did find a small effect for these physical activity interventions for improving physical activity levels, which on average was about 6 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So this is a very small effect. So we know this is in line with what we see in healthy kids. So we need to do a little bit better. We also looked to see, we rated each of the studies in our review for behavioral techniques, and there's a taxonomy that we used that addresses 40 possible behavioral techniques, such as goal planning, self-monitoring, making an action plan, deriving feedback from somebody about your behavior. So we also rated each of these studies, and we found that out of the 40 possible behavioral techniques, these studies used 25. The median number was 6 used per study. And the ones that had the strongest support from our, based on our evidence, were goal and planning techniques. So things like self-monitoring, action planning, feedback about your behavior, as well as a technique called motivational interviewing, which is sort of where you counsel someone and you try to move their behavior towards their target behavior. And we also found limited support for social cognitive theory. So based on all of these findings, we now have an outcome measurement tool to measure physical activity that's valid for kids with chronic conditions. We can address adherence issues, hopefully by tailoring and knowing where children are at in their readiness to take part in physical activity. And we can use these behavioral techniques and strategies to try and, again, help these children adopt more physical activity within their lives. So the next steps are, I'm actually working with the neurology group at Sickkids, and we're hoping to pilot an intervention where we start incorporating some of these strategies to see if we can get children with physical activity, or children with chronic diseases, to become more physically active. And I know that Catherine's work actually draws a lot upon these strategies, and she'll be sharing some of her results with you actually now. So I just want to thank CIHR for their funding, and the University of Toronto, as well as my committee and many of our collaborators for their help with these projects. Thank you. Yeah.
I can do it. Thank you. Thank you, Sam, for that presentation. So now my role is really just to talk to you a bit about some of the work that, I guess, the more exciting studies that we've done in my lab, but really focusing on the improvements or the importance of mental health to help with physical activity. So you saw the benefits and the importance of physical activity, and my role is really to show the important role of mental health in helping kids with physical activity behaviors. So really just to identify the links between physical activity and mental health, and to ultimately provide some strategies that hopefully you can walk away from today to help understand how to help more kids become more active, is the ultimate goal of this presentation. So just to start off, I did want to present to you our new Mental Health and Physical Activity Research Center at the University of Toronto. We're located in the Athletic Centre for anyone who is familiar. And the reason why I have these pictures up here is just to show that the main goal of the Mental Health and Physical Activity Research Center, which we call MPARC, is really to do intervention research as well as ambulatory research, or having the equipment available within our lab to allow people to measure things like physical activity and mood and mental health outside of the laboratory. And one of the main reasons for this is that as much as the space is beautiful and lovely, I am actually not a proponent of having people come to the lab to do interventions, because we know that we give them everything that they need to be successful while they're there, and then at some point those studies end, and we have to then let them into their real world environments where we then see all the benefits that they gained decrease to some extent. And so, oftentimes, as you know, in intervention research, it's very rare to see people follow up on intervention studies. We see the wonderful results in the first period, and then we see very little following up. So we're really focused on helping people build the strategies that they need to be successful, like what Sam talked about, and then in their real world environments being able to maintain those. And just to highlight that the MPARC space is completely accessible space, so that we do have all equipment related to anything to do with physical disabilities, as well as we've tried to structure the environments differently depending on both mental and physical health that we're targeting. So in this picture you do see mirrors. We have another room where there are no mirrors. So really trying to create exercise spaces for a group of different target populations. So as you already heard, current trends in physical activity are not getting any better. I have data up here from 2012 where we showed the Canadian youth, 9% of them are not meeting physical activity guidelines. You just heard that 9% is still consistent as of last week. So we know that kids are not active enough to gain both physical and mental health benefits. And we also know across the board that boys are more active than girls. So girls, 4% of girls accumulate physical activity. And you also saw a nice schematic, a little bit more exciting than my textual slide here, but showing the benefits of physical activity for youth. And anything related to things like body composition and cardiovascular health, as well as a lot of the research that we focus on is building things like self-confidence, self-efficacy, self-esteem. So the foundational elements that help people become more physically active and stay more active from a mental health perspective. As if you were following the news, I think actually just this week or last week as well, the 24-hour movement guidelines were published from the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology. And these guidelines actually propose the connection between physical activity, sleep, and sedentary behavior. So putting those things together into a schematic that's on the screen here, but basically demonstrating that kids need to be active for at least 60 minutes, 3 days per week or more. There needs to be light physical activity throughout the day. I was extremely pleased to see that light physical activity was actually included in this, because we tend to focus on the moderate to vigorous activity, and as I'll talk to you about in a second, most people, whether we're talking about kids or adults, do not like moderate to vigorous physical activity. So when we're asked to help people become active, and people say, well, what's the best activity for my child to be active at those intensities? And I say, well, the best activity is the activity your kid likes. Because if I tell you that running is the best activity and they hate it, they're never going to do it. It's like eating broccoli. If you don't like broccoli, you're not going to eat it. So one of the benefits of this movement guideline is the addition of that, sort of focusing on just moving a little bit more, or light activity, as well as the sleep and the sedentary behavior. So it puts it together in perspective in terms of what we're focusing on for youth. So today, as I mentioned, I'm just going to talk to you a bit about the connection between physical activity and mental health. And it is this cyclical scenario where if you have improvements in mental health, you will exercise more. If you exercise more, there's improvements in mental health, and it goes the opposite way as well. So a couple of studies just to highlight for you that we've conducted. One study where we followed youth over a 10-year period, starting in high school and then into early adulthood. And what we were looking at was whether mental health, or in this case depression levels, over the course of adolescence were related to participation in activity in early adulthood. And what you can see on this slide, I know you can't really see the numbers, but to give you the picture, the black line on your left at the top are those youth who were high on depressive symptoms throughout adolescence. The dotted line at the bottom were those who were low, and in the middle there were moderate levels of depressive symptoms early on, and then sort of increasing over the course of adolescence. And what we found in these data were that the youth in that group 3, so the higher depressive symptom group, were less likely to participate in physical activity generally or sport participation in early adulthood. So there was this sort of predictive mechanism that we could talk about where youth who had sort of stable and higher depressive symptoms were less likely to be active. And so it highlights the idea that we need to target mental health early on in high schools to be able to help people maintain physical activity routines across the lifespan. And one of the benefits, I guess, of having our new mental health and physical activity research center is that we've had quite a good press for individual teachers from the TDSB, for example, who want us to come into high schools and help them develop programs to improve mental health, and also then with the secondary sort of goal of improving physical activity. Another study that we focused on, as you saw earlier, girls are much less likely to participate in physical activity than boys. They're also far more likely to drop out of sport participation during adolescence. And so what we've been trying to do is identify what are the reasons why girls drop out of sport faster than boys. And one of the main reasons that we hear often is that it's related to body image. So as soon as girls' bodies start to change, it takes them away from sort of that ideal. They tend to drop out of sport. But there's been no empirical evidence to show anything related to mental health, factors related to body image or self-esteem that ties into sport participation. So what we've been doing is following girls over time to identify what are the reasons for sport dropout. And the focus of this study that's up here now is related to emotions that are tied to what the body can do and what the body looks like. So body image generally speaking, but what we find is that girls who report higher levels of shame and increases in shame over time are related to lower levels of enjoyment, commitment to sport, higher levels of competitive anxiety, and more likely to drop out of sport. So in this study, shame and envy, so that sort of social comparison factor, are really important for girls in terms of trying to keep them involved in physical activity generally, or sport participation more specifically. So based on this study, we've been able to develop some positive psychology interventions based on some of the strategies that I'll talk to you about in a second that will help girls reduce sort of those feelings of shame and guilt and envy to help them try to keep more girls involved in physical activity. Another study that we focused on, so those two are really the mental health to physical activity link. Another study that we've been focusing on is how physical activity then improves mental health. And so what we've looked at in the data that are up on the screen here is whether participation in sport during adolescence then relates to mental health in early adulthood. So sort of the flip side of what I presented earlier. And what we see, I'll just put up this actually because it's a little bit more telling, is that for youth who participate in more years of sport participation in high school, it's related to decreases in depression up to 6 years. These data were 6 years after high school. So the interesting, I guess, part of this is that it really is related to team sport. So getting kids involved in the social aspect of physical activity. And Sam's slide around the deconditioning also highlights the idea for youth with chronic disease or chronic illness, the importance of targeting social dimensions because of that idea of social isolation. So we see that the social aspect of sport participation or physical activity generally is extremely important for mental health later on. As you also see, individual sports, there was no significant association, but it certainly isn't the same sort of almost dose response that we see with team sport and depression levels. So with that said, we need to be able to understand, how do we help kids become more physically active? What are the factors related to helping youth increase their physical activity levels? And if you do a summary of the literature, generally speaking, I have a list here of the factors that relate to physical activity in youth. And the top level factors in the lighter blue are things that, generally speaking, we can't change. So we know, as I've mentioned earlier, that boys are more active than girls. We know that age, as kids age, they tend to do less activity. We know that. Weight status, so we do a lot of trials with kids with obesity, for example, and there's sort of a funny relationship there. Some studies say there is an association. Heavier kids do less activity. Some find the complete opposite, so heavier kids do more activity. So it's inconclusive evidence around weight status. The opportunity for physical activity, the idea of if you build it, will they come, will they play, it's inconclusive. You know, you can really try to build the best program possible and no one might come and as you mentioned with the arthritis trial, you know, you'd give them what they can and 50% of the youth actually engage in it. So inconclusive around environment. Movement difficulties, so any sort of physical illness or disability, the weakness around muscle, balance, tightness, range of motion, and coordination difficulties. There is strong evidence that all of those factors relate to lower levels of physical activity. And then the bottom side of this slide are the factors that we can control. So we know that autonomy, or giving kids or youth control over their activity to some extent, is moderate to some extent. We know that the barrier literature is inconclusive. You know, generally speaking, everybody has physical activity barriers, and most of those barriers are actually some things that we can intervene on. Competence and self-efficacy, I'll spend more time on that, but strong evidence that competence is extremely important for physical activity. Motivation, enjoyment, all strong evidence. And social connections and support, there is some evidence, so low to moderate levels around social connections. So I'm going to spend some time talking about competence, motivation, enjoyment, and how we can improve those for, in particular, youth for physical activity. I'm actually going to flip over this. So generally speaking, we see that, actually I won't flip over this. The bottom of this slide is this was a large study of the National Longitudinal Study of Youth and Children. And what we found was, in addition to all the others that I've just spoken to you about, one of the key factors related to whether kids were active or not was this idea of enjoyment. And I've already alluded to that in the case of interventions or the types of activities that we want kids to be able to do. It's extremely important. And so we need to be able to highlight what it is about enjoyment that helps kids become more physically active. And I'll tie this into, is anyone familiar with self-determination theory? So I'll tie enjoyment into self-determination theory for a second. And on the screen here is highlighted a whole bunch of different motives that people use to engage in physical activity. And they range from the far left-hand side of the screen, which is really no interest in motivation, to the far end of right side, which is activity that's performed because it's enjoyable and interesting. So if we can help youth become more self-determined in their physical activity levels, or for physical activity, then it will improve their physical activity levels. So just to give you a snapshot of that, we did a study actually looking at self-determined motivation in youth in high schools to look at whether we could manipulate or whether self-determined motivation was related to youth participation in physical activity. And so what we did was in a sample of 528 adolescents, we basically looked at their motivation levels. We identified them as being self-determined, or that more I exercise because I enjoy it, versus those kids who exercise because they're told to or because they feel like they need to, that sort of more controlled motivation. And what we did was we compared those youth in 2 different physical activity or physical education classes. One class where we were standing with the teacher, and the teacher had a structured basketball free throw lesson plan. So all the kids engaged in basketball free throws. The other condition, and these were counterbalanced, was where we stood with the teacher, and the teacher said, "Oh, I just have to talk to these individuals for a second. The basketballs are out, do what you want." And so the idea was that in the free choice, when kids were given the option of doing whatever they wanted, did their enjoyment of physical activity predict how active they actually were? In both of these conditions, they wore accelerometers so that we could measure their physical activity levels. And so what we found was, as self-determination theory would suggest, as well as I'm suggesting here today, is that those kids who enjoyed activity more, or the self-determined youth, were much more likely to engage in physical activity during the free class than their peers. So if they enjoy physical activity, they were more likely to go and pick up the basketballs and actually be more active during that time when they could choose to do what they wanted to do. So enjoyment and interest is extremely important. And the other side of that is also based on a number of theories, is that the idea of self-efficacy or competence. So in addition to enjoying the activity, you have to feel like you can engage in the activity in order to actually be physically active. So one of our studies that we did looked at this idea of enjoyment and competence perceptions in adolescents, and found that basically the bottom line of this picture is that competence beliefs were equally important for predicting physical activity levels in youth. And also based on these data, what we found was that parents and friends, best friends, both helped build those perceptions of competence and enjoyment. So parents play a role in terms of helping kids feel like they can engage in physical activity, so do friends, as well as enjoying physical activity for both boys and girls. So based on this, and a whole bunch of other research that we've done that I'm not going to share with you today, we can see that we need to also target parents and friends. So it's not just about the youth themselves, but we need to help get more parents engaged in the process of helping youth become involved in physical activity. And what we've seen from, again, especially some qualitative research that we've done with youth, is that youth enjoy getting instructions and feedback and information from their friends, but they don't from their parents. So that's one of the things that has been quite clear. They enjoy the tangible support from their parents, so they like the fact that their parents give them money to do activity and equipment. The emotional support is extremely important, so the encouragement type of support from both parents and friends, and role modeling also from both parents and friends. So if parents can engage in activity with their youth, as well as friends engaging in activity, are both extremely important factors related to building enjoyment and competence for physical activity. We also, in a study of youth who are at risk for obesity because both of their parents have BMIs over 35, so they're 4 times more likely to become obese as they age as well. These data we're looking at whether the parents help, again, just sort of teasing apart now what parent might have more of an influence on the youth. And as you can see from this slide, even though fathers provided more support, or the kids perceived that fathers provided more support than mothers, mothers had a stronger impact on building competence than fathers. So even though mothers tend to be less active, the youth see that they provide less support for physical activity than the fathers, they have a stronger role to play in actually building those competence beliefs. So, taking from that, we really have to focus again on and this ties back to, girls in sport and girls in physical activity. We know that women across the lifespan are less involved in physical activity, engagements or activities And so, we really need to tie in that mothers have an important role to play for physical activity. And some of the side projects that we've been doing suggest that mothers have a different parenting style than fathers. And so, as you can see on the screen there, fathers tend to be perceived to be more playful and fun in terms of the activity, and mothers are more organized and structured. So, if we can sort of try to stop to change the roles around physical activity for mothers and fathers, we might be able to see some more benefits related to engagement in activity. So we know that competence beliefs and enjoyment for youth are extremely important for physical activity, and that all of this combined builds mental health. So then I guess the next question would be, how do you develop that idea of self-determined motivation or enjoyment in activity? And I've put a few suggestions for you on the slide here. So one key piece is about previous experiences that youth have, reminding them or talking to them about enjoyable activities that they engaged in, challenging activities, modeling from friends and parents, like I've said earlier. Videos also work really well. Social media now, that it's so prevalent, we can really see the influence both positively and negatively on physical activity involvement. Feedback related to encouragement of physical activity. We also know the physical and emotional factors, so things like helping kids realize that sweating and increased heart rates are good things, not bad things or scary. Reducing the idea of anxiety and fear. As I've already alluded to as well, providing kids with choices. So whatever you're engaging in activities, whether it's choices related to the type of clothing they wear, the activities that they engage in, how they're evaluated, if there is an evaluation method, really not prescribing anything, but giving it in the idea of choice is extremely important. And giving opportunities. And one of the key pieces is that youth can be involved in their own goal setting. So we often have taken this like top-down approach and said, you need to engage in this. Or even if we take the movement guidelines or the physical activity guidelines, there's this high-level thing that people need to achieve that is then undermining their self-efficacy or their competence. So we need to be able to dispel all of that and to be able to help them build their own goals and their own strategies to help increase their physical activity levels. And then just some others in terms of modifying the number of participants. So a lot of our research and others show, the number of children involved in any group activity increases enjoyment. Larger spaces where kids can go and do free play sort of thing is extremely important. Reducing the rules, so that there's not that complexity level in structured sport or activity if there is some involved. And the equipment can also be changed to help youth enjoy it more and also be more competent in that. So I think I'll leave you with those, and there's time for questions now for either of us.
Are there any questions? Yes.
In this study with the physical education program where they had to pre-clear the structure, did it with lower self-efficacy? Like, how did they perform?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so,
Oh, in the study of the basketball study, did the kids have lower self-efficacy? Is that?
do already have lower self-efficacy? I don't know if that's something you measured, but if they already had low self-efficacy, how did they perform? You mentioned that because higher self-efficacy did better with unstructured play.
Yeah, it wasn't related to self-efficacy as much as motivation. So if they endorsed the idea that they engaged in physical activity because they enjoyed it, they were more likely to do more activity. It was irregardless of their perceptions of competence or their self-efficacy. So those were controlled for in the analysis in terms of actual level of ability, and it was more related to whether they enjoyed the activity or whether they enjoyed physical activity generally. Did they do more activity when they were given the choice?
So if they didn't enjoy physical activity,
they did less activity in the free choice than the free throw. Everybody basically did equal amount of activity in the structured class because it was very structured. It was only the free choice where it was really quite discernible in terms of the enjoyment of activity being quite a strong predictor there. Any other questions? Yes.
When you were talking about the exercise programs and participation and how girls didn't participate as much as teens, something I saw a few years ago when I volunteered at a basketball tournament at March break, and I hadn't seen this before. The 4 coaches were picking their teams, but as they picked them, only the coaches knew who was being ticked off the list, and then at the end they announced their teams. And I thought, boy, that's changed since I was little, where it would be out loud, and if you were picked last, not only did you know you were picked last, everybody knew you were the one nobody wanted on their team, right? And so it just seemed to me that kind of approach, it makes a big difference too, because most of the kids that were picked last when they were in little grades, they don't even, they drop gym as soon as they can and they never go out for sports. So it really impacts their self-esteem.
Yeah, so I mean, generally the question would be that around choice or picking teams and the outward nature of that. And what I can say is that we have come quite far in terms of identifying that social comparison, whether it's in academics or in sport, is quite different than it used to be. And so the idea of grading or the idea of choosing people is not as an outward of a task as it once was, for the reason of building competence and enjoyment in activity. So if you don't really know where you fall among others, you're doing it's basically perpetuating the idea that you're doing it for yourself, or that self-reference versus social reference. And that's critical, especially for youth, to be able to engage in and stay involved in physical activities for the reasons that you mentioned.
Yeah, and the feeling that we're all part of the team. You weren't someone that nobody wanted, but they have to take, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's extremely important to reduce any level of social comparison, especially for anyone in the room who does work in group activities here or with kids with different levels of ability and different levels of disability. It's also extremely important to not highlight any of that and to be very inclusive so that it is that self-reference versus social reference. And as one of my slides had, the idea of envy or the social comparison is extremely important for youth to be able to engage and enjoy their activity involvement. And so if we can reduce any level of social comparison, there's tremendous benefits to that. Yes?
Thanks so much for your presentation. That was actually super cool research. And some of my research is kind of related to it as well. So I look at youth athletes with persistent concussion issues and currently running an intervention study. But one of the questions I have for you is, do you think, and I'm also looking at self-efficacy and how they think they're doing across the study. One of the things that I've kind of thought about over time is how other areas of self-efficacy might limit them to engage in physical activity, not just their own perceptions of the physical image or their body image or how maybe they're not being an athlete anymore, but more so, were they confident in their school performance before? Were they confident in their friend circles? And I feel like that might lead to how they engage or re-engage in physical activity. Have you done stuff to look at that also, like on a broader level, how they feel across these various domains and how that transfers back into physical activity?
Yeah, so the question is about different domains of self-efficacy and how that impacts perceptions in these different domains related to academics or social or relational, and how those then impact their activity involvement in youth. And really it stems from models of the self, for example, where we know that the physical self, so how you feel physically, is the strongest predictor of self-esteem and overall in life. However, all the other domains related to, school, and then you can break down school into all the different facets or courses, and then relational self and social self, and all of those are important. But the physical self is the strongest tie to self-esteem more generally. And so it builds the confidence that's needed in order to build the most around physical activity. There is some research now sort of tying in how things transfer. So does your self-efficacy in one area transfer to another? And the unfortunate part, I guess, with that is that the physical self is so different than all the other facets. So, educational self or relational self, there's a lot more connections between those two than there are with how the body works and feels and looks, which is the highest, I guess, tied to self-esteem. And then that is then tied to whether people have the confidence to actually engage in particular team sport versus individual sport, for example.
Are there any questions? I'd like to thank you both so much for your talks today. Actually, I'm just as I'm running around to give you these thank yous as well for coming today.
Thank you.
So thank you both.
Thank you.